Hey guys, welcome to BP, the Bible Perspective. The problem disagreeing with John McWhorter's view on victimhood. Now, before we get into it, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. I came across a video I want to discuss with Professor John McWhorter. And the title of the clip is The Elite Status of Victimhood. Now, my first knee-jerk reaction was to disagree with him. But when I listened to him, I had to ask myself, what am I disagreeing with? And that's what I want to discuss. When we talk about this subject of victim and victimhood, especially as it is bantered about in today's political circles, there are people who are saying that black people, for example, are playing the victim. Now, in reality, the term is used in a broader sense. In other words, you come across a person who may talk about their being late, and they may cry, and they may play the victim, which has nothing to do with them being late. Or again, there are many applications to that you can apply. But mostly, when I see it from a racial perspective, and especially against African Americans. So my question is, even though I agree with some of the things that he's saying, and also disagree with some of the stuff that he's saying, let's first ask the question, well, what is a victim? And then what is victimhood? Because again, African Americans today are accused by conservatives as playing the victim. So in order to be able to accuse African Americans of playing the victims, you kind of have to say that they're not victims. And this is really what some conservatives are saying. Now, this discussion in which John McWhorter is participating in, this panel discussion, he brings up some good points. But before I get into this, play the clip, let's kind of set some terms of what a victim is. See? So let's say, for example, you have a wife, a married woman. And let's say she gets raped. So the first thing we have established by saying she got raped, that she is a victim of a violent crime, a violent assault, a violent sexual assault. She's a victim. That makes her a victim. The next question is, what trauma was inflicted on her by that assault? And of course, it's really going to be kind of dependent upon the woman herself, right? Then the third thing would be, well, what help was given to the woman after the assault to help her heal from the assault? Because the assault then afflicted emotional distress and pain, physical distress and pain, and mental distress and pain. So now if you say, well, how long should it take for her to get over that trauma? There's no way you can answer that, and you would be a fool to try to answer it, okay? But the idea is to understand that this is what that one assault could do. Now let's say 6 months later, she still hasn't gotten over the trauma. She has nightmares when her husband touches her. She recalls. She cannot respond sexually to her husband because of the trauma. And he might go, and out of frustration, he might say, well, how long does it take for her to get over the trauma? Now, again, he would be foolish to voice it. He may think it, but he may be foolish to voice it. Now, in order for him to kind of deal with that, and I know I feel like I'm being very clinical here, But in order for him to be able to answer that question, he would have to ask, what was the trauma? How did it affect her? Right? How did the assault itself affect her? Emotionally, physically, and mentally. Then he has to ask himself the question. 6 months later, he has to ask himself the question. Well, what was done to help her heal? Did she see a psychologist or a pastor or something like that? So what was done? So those have to be the questions that you would have to ask to say, for him to be able to even think about daring to say, honey, it's time for you to get over this victimhood. But let's say nothing was done, right? Let's say nothing was done. And let's say after a year, she still has the trauma, but she doesn't share it. She sometimes expresses it, and he doesn't understand it. But let's say that she musters through and is intimate with her husband, and then she gets pregnant, and they have a child. Now let's fast forward 15, maybe 20 years. She's never dealt with the trauma from day one, right? Maybe the trauma was dismissed. Maybe her husband, of course, being clueless, and I have to say sometimes I can be guilty of that, being a man. Maybe he cluelessly just doesn't clue in the trauma that's still there. But then 15, 20 years later, now, how does she now pass that down to her child? Maybe she has a daughter. How does she pass that to her daughter? What is the trauma in that? The trauma in... So maybe she tells her daughter, you can't trust men. Never trust a man. Maybe she comes home and she sees that her daughter has a boyfriend. They're making out on the couch and she freaks out. Daughters wonder, Mama, why are you freaking out? See, and never realized the roots of that trauma. Now, by the way, let me just say this: I'm not trying to be clinical here because I'm in no way qualified. But I've heard enough, right, to be able to ask these questions. So now let's talk about the African American experience. So let's go back to 1619 when it began. The first slaves landed on this soil as slaves. This is their experience, their first experience to the New World. From 1619 to 1776, there was slavery, 157 years of slavery, generations after generations of African Americans born into slavery, some imported into slavery. It wouldn't be to about 18, I think it's 1825 that the U.S. banned the import and export of slaves, mostly import, of course. But you can still keep your slave if you own them. So the end run around that is keep breeding them. But let's back up. In 1776, the U.S. Constitution was drafted, which says all men are created equal, granted rights by the Creator, inalienable rights by the Creator. Everybody celebrated except African Americans because they were slaves. So what was the impact of the trauma there? Everybody else was free except them. And side note, this is why so many white conservatives today, like Texas, Florida, are doing their best to deflect from this reality, this truth. So 1776, from 1776 to 1865, another 80 years, you had slavery. Then in 1865, the bloodiest war on American soil was fought. The bloodiest war. At the end of that war, slavery was abolished. African Americans are free. So let's ask the question. The trauma for all that time from 1619 to 1776, the trauma, the generational trauma that was inflicted from generation to generation. You are a slave. You are less than human. You're a nigger. Right? Okay. 1865, what was done to help aid the newly freed Americans in their new life? Now, here's an interesting tidbit. They did give reparations to the slave owners for the loss of their property. Let me tell you another story. This is found in the Bible with King David and his children. Now, King David had, every one of his kids were drop dead gorgeous. He had a son that was enamored with one of his daughters. He was so in love with his sister that the Bible says he was sick of love. He loved her intensely. Finally, he hatched a plan to get her alone, and when he did that, he raped her. Now, after he had raped her, now remember, he loved her so much, he had to have her, She begged him, don't do this. Ask the king and he would give you, we can get married, right? Yeah, that's wacky back then, but nevertheless, he was just, don't do this. Nevertheless, he forced her. And when he was finished his assault, his rape, the Bible says he hated her more intently than when he loved her. So much to the fact that he ordered his servants to throw her out. And she begged him, don't do this. She threw him out and they slammed the door and locked the door. She said this treatment was worse than a rape. In other words, once he got what he wanted, he discarded her. Keep that in mind. So now we come to 1865. What was done to the African Americans? They were wronged by this nation. They were abused, right? Women were raped. Women were imagine a man were, again, emasculated, whipped, beat. Imagine having your child just sold off to another slave owner, just snatched from your arms and sold off. Women, again, ravaged. What was the trauma that was inflicted? The emotional, physical, and mental trauma. What did that produce in a single race of people by this free land? Well, 20 years later, they invented a set of laws known as Jim Crow laws. And just as the story with David and his son, when America no longer profit from us, use us as they will, rape, right? Control. When it was illegal for them to do those things, they discarded us. They discarded us in one of the worst ways, right? They treated us as inhuman, inferior. Even though you paid the same bus fare, you had to sit in the back of the bus. You had to drink from separate fountains, okay? Separate fountains, water fountains, which I thought was stupid. You paid more money for separate fountains, plumbing and all of that. But anyway, you couldn't eat in the same cafes. And all of that was to show that white people were superior and black people were inferior. What do you think that did to the emotional, mental, and physical state of being to the African American? Lynchings were uncommon. You could lynch someone. Whole entire towns would come out to lynchings. Think about that. So what kind of trauma did that afflict? Now, and then in 1965, after a hard-fought Civil War struggle, they finally abolished the constitutionally protected legal racism against African Americans by the United States of America. So now, what was the emotional, mental, and physical trauma afflicted on generations after generations after generations of African Americans? So now we come to 1965, just a little over 50 years. how long does it take for the African Americans, the when you, even though we're not monolithic by no means, generation after generation, what was the effect of that on this race of people? We can answer that question, but what do you think so what do you think? Were we not victims at this point? And then what was done to say, let's heal them of this victimhood? So with that, now I want to go into, because I want you to have that understanding when we go into listening to Professor McWhorter's um, speech or talk in this panel discussion, as he called it, the elite status of victimhood. So let's get into it. All right, here we go.
I think we need to consider how peculiar our circumstances are in terms of what we're up against. Psychologists are familiar with something called the victimization mindset. That is
Now, obviously, we're cutting in on some of the panel discussion here. But again, so we're just going to focus on what he is saying in this clip here.
a race-neutral concept. It's something that happens to human beings in all cultures.
Let me kind of go back just a little bit here.
Cultures. And the victimization mindset is one that exaggerates the degree of one's victimhood. It's most common among people who are not victims in any sense that most people would think. It's an
Okay, so I want to say this. Remember, he's being very vague. So he's not specifically talking about African Americans, or at least he's not naming them. I think he is referring to them. He's just not verbally saying it. So with that, let me also say, if he is talking about African Americans, then should we not then qualify if they are truly victims or playing the victims? People who are not victims playing the victims. Okay.
elite, it's often an advantaged way of thinking, but you exaggerate your victimhood. The person
Okay, I'm going to go back and I want you to hear. I know I cut in with him. I cut in a little bit, but I want you to hear again kind of what he is saying.
exaggerates the degree of one's victim, what we're up against. Psychologists are familiar with something called the victimization mindset. That is a race-neutral concept. It's something that happens to human beings in all cultures. And the victimization mindset is one that exaggerates the degree of one's victimhood. It's most common among people who are not victims in any sense that most people would think. It's an elite, it's often an advantaged way of thinking. But you exaggerate your victimhood. The person who is under the victimization mindset tends to downplay even the obvious victimization of other people. And the person under the influence of the victimization mindset walks around constantly offended at their victimization not being sufficiently acknowledged. This is a kind of person. This is not a schoolyard taunt. This is the way that a modern human being might wind up.
So again, it's hard for me to respond to that other than to say I agree, because he's not specifically identifying one group of people.
We're seeing with the way race is discussed in America, especially among elites who then have a disproportionate influence on people.
So there he talks about race. So now he's bringing in race. So now we can infer that maybe he's talking about black people. Maybe he's talking about black people overplaying victimhood. Okay.
Who are not elites, is the victimization mindset institutionalized. What we're seeing is a particular way of being treated as a norm rather than as an aberration. And so what you have is a sometimes tacit and sometimes explicit idea that, for example, what gives you a challenge makes you weaker rather than.
So let me just say this too, and I know I'm cutting in a lot, but if he is referring to what the modern day Karen is, I would say amen, because the modern day Karen plays the victim. The modern day Karen is one who will create a hostile circumstances and then call the police, usually on a black person, for doing something like walking their dog, walking in a parking lot in their own home, and they demand ID or demand whatever. And then when the person resists, they start crying. They'll call the police. Like in one particular case, where a white woman, I think her dog was unleashed, whatever, and the guy told her to put a leash on the dog, and she started going off, and then she called the police. She even said, "I'm going to call the police and say a black man is attacking me." That is playing the victimhood, in my opinion. All right, here we go. Now, if you're talking about that, I say I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. All right. And I would also agree that there's some black people that overplay their victimhood. Like if you're late all the time at work, and then when they write you up or fire you, you say victim. No, they fired you because you were late. Okay, here we go.
Then what gives you a challenge makes you stronger. There is a tacit or sometimes not tacit idea that the world is divided between good and bad people, and that you're supposed to think along those lines. There's a tacit or sometimes not tacit idea that you're supposed to always trust your feelings. What I'm doing here is I'm recapitulating the tenets that Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt list in their really underread and underacknowledged book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And those three tenets are things that no normal person would instruct in their children, but which we're taught are somehow an important watch cry for groups of people and how we are to view groups of people. It's the institutionalization of that. And one thing that I think gets missed is how comfortable the victimization mindset is if you're not a victim. People choose this because it's a way of feeling good in the world. It's not people who are trying to seek power. That's only a small minority of the people in question. It feels good to pretend to be a victim in modern society. I've seen this all of my life. I wouldn't have known what vocabulary to put to it. But even back when I was a grad student at Stanford, this is 1990, May, the undergraduates responded to what anybody would have thought of as a very minor series of discrepancies, Black and Latino and Native American undergraduates in particular. And they chose it as an opportunity to take over the faculty administrative building, and a lot of them were put into a bus and taken downtown and arrested, et cetera. And I was
Okay, now here's what I'm gonna halfway agree with him on. Um, that he's talking about when it kind of been on college campuses. You kind of know that okay, you got various groups. So oftentimes when you have, especially some Afro, they may call themselves Afro studies, Afro groups, whatever, Black American groups, or whatever it is they may call them today, and they tend to be the more um, uh, vocal group on racial issues. Okay, now, uh, so on the one hand, you might say you guys are keep constantly um, complaining about race when they themselves are literally on a college campus getting an education. Okay, now the only other thing that could happen is that are African American students on college campuses then mistreated by faculty, securities, professors, so forth and so on. So that would be the issue right here. Again, he's being vague. So here we go.
was much less interested in this sort of thing back then because I was trying to get a PhD in a subject that had nothing to do with race issues. But I remember watching this conflagration because I didn't have anything to do that afternoon. And the thing that struck me was that the students being taken away to jail in the bus, none of them really spent any time there, but they're being taken away, the local news is there, is that they were all smiling. And I thought, if this is serious, why are they making all those faces? Why are they joyous? And then some of them were editorialists for the paper. the campus paper, and the next day, a week after, they were writing joyous editorials. And I thought, there.
Now, I can tell you why they were smiling. It's not just that they were playing the victimhood here, but a lot of them could have been excited that they were part of a movement, a part of a cause. That's just one example of it. It doesn't mean that they was like, okay, as he is putting it, you know, they're just kind of playing the victimhood here. No, a lot of them felt and they were proud and joyous to be a part of what they felt was a cause or a movement.
Imitating what happened here in the 50s and 60s. But if you look at the black and white newsreels of Dr. King in Birmingham, no one is smiling. So
That is absolutely not true. You look at plenty of reels where they had students who were being arrested, and they were dancing, they were smiling. There's one where a guy is actually dancing as the water hose are hitting him, and you could see that they were corralled in buses and jam packed into jail cells. You saw smiling faces there, not distress. Why? Because they were a part of a movement, and and now he is correct. Like a lot of times, the older uh, civil rights um, leaders and freedom fighters weren't smiling, but the young kids, there were a lot of them that certainly were smiling.
why the joy? And it was the joy because they were adopting the victimization complex, and because they were affluent and fortunate kids, black though they were happy. And you see this again and again. You fast forward. I was a young professor at UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, and there was a conference thrown by the African American Studies Department when it became a PhD program. And there were people from all over the Bay Area, and there was, frankly, I wouldn't have said it out loud at the time, rampant, brilliant, articulate, and shameless exaggeration of the race situation in the United States in 1995. And even then, and I'm getting a little older, but I hadn't really spoken out yet, I noticed everybody here is so happy. Everybody here is so warm. There's a sense of warm fellowship in this room as people talk about their supposed victimhood. Now I.
So again, you go back to Berkeley. Berkeley is was one of the centers of protest. It's a very liberal school, but it was one of the centers of protest. People were protesting. So not only just with African American issues, but also just kind of also all kinds of social issues. Again, it's not that people were adopting a victimhood mentality; they were a part of a movement. I see what he's saying, but I would say that a lot of people really felt that they were making a difference here, not just, oh, I'm expressing that it was some kind of expression on their part just to say, let me kind of nurse, this victim mentality. Some people, yes, but not all.
I know what that was. Any psychologist would know what it was. It's the victimization mindset, an aberration, having been adopted as a norm. And the thing is, this is quite unprecedented, I'm sure, in human relations. And by human, I mean Homo sapiens. I mean 300,000 years of this species. Has there ever been any society, any people, anywhere, and I don't just mean last week, I mean over the past 300,000 years, where the disadvantaged group wallows in victimhood even as it's passing? It's very peculiar, and yet the people.
Now, I will take issue with his phrase because this is what he said, that the disadvantage, not just group. Now, he went from, and on college campuses, people who grew up maybe in affluence, and in his case, didn't have, in a sense, a reason to connect to victimhood. I disagree with that too, because again, like for example, in the 1960s, there was a white lady who was a very integral part of the movement. She used a car. She came from a kind of a middle class home, and she used a car and helped transport, again, civil rights freedom fighters, and then ultimately she was killed by the Klan. Now, um, her thing was she was a part of a movement, and so I take kind of this what I push back on when he says the disadvantage wallowing in. What exactly are they wallowing in if you're not saying that the opportunities were there to prevent them from wallowing in? Remember in 1865, I asked what was done to help African Americans as a group to heal from the atrocities of Jim Crow. What help was done? So what were they wallowing in? Okay.
People in question are good people. They're not bad. They don't deserve to be made fun of, but you just wonder, why would anyone do this? And I think it's contingency. It's chance. We have to always leave room for the fortuitous in our sense of how social history goes. There are always things that are just because. If that asteroid hadn't hit 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs would have become more sophisticated and mammals wouldn't have become big and we wouldn't be here. If you look at an old cartoon character, often they're wearing gloves. Why? Why does Bugs Bunny wear gloves? The reason that Bugs Bunny wears gloves is because early cartoon characters were based on minstrel stage performers who often wore gloves. That's why Mickey Mouse wears gloves. Why doesn't he just have hands? Chance is the way.
Well, I don't understand his point of bringing up Mickey Mouse, especially if you're not going to describe that yes, the minstrel shows happen because one, this is the way white America wanted to portray black people, and two, white people would dress up in blackface and not give opportunities for black actors to act. So I'm not sure of his use of the term Mickey Mouse. Informative, yes. Okay.
Way these things go. In this, I think that the victimization mindset has become so popular, partly because of the vast success in America and beyond in prescribing racism, so that you have a dominant class who are ready to embrace and support people who are taking the victimization mindset too far by acknowledging that they understand what racism is. And then I think we've seen what's really happened lately because of the peculiarity of social media. That story has not been written yet. We're still living.
Okay, so again, I think he's again talking about black people without specifically naming them. And again, so my question would be, are they truly victims? And then what was done to help said victims in 1965? Because then from that point on, if the trauma was never healed for generations after generations after generations, then it was passed on. So then it's people dealing with what their surroundings are. Okay, this is what they are. These are the conditions that were produced by this nation.
Living it. But in 2009, everything changed. It wasn't so much 2020 as 2009. That's
I thought he was going to say Barack Obama, but he's not.
becoming a distant time. But 2009 was the year where it went from what's Twitter to, oh, you're not on Twitter. It was also that year that your mother was on Facebook, that year, 2009. And next thing you know, social media is everywhere, and I live in it myself. But that means that an aberration of this kind, especially if it's so attractive, if it gives you such a feeling of warmth and belonging, can spread faster and madder than it would have had any way to do otherwise. It used to be that you would have had to read a magazine article. That's not going to have the effect of articulate and ongoing tweets in particular. And so we're dealing with something extremely unprecedented, extremely peculiar. And in order to get past it, there are all sorts of suggestions that we can discuss. But I think that we have to understand that so often what we're dealing with is not the way it has to be. And so the cartoon characters don't have to have gloves. Black America and beyond doesn't have to wallow in victimhood idly.
Now, I'm going to stop and say you're correct. They don't have to, so you have to ask the question, why did they, and who are the ones that's putting Mickey Mouse in minstrel gloves? And then if you say that they don't have to wallow in victimhood, um, agreed. All right, agreed. I'm gonna tell you I'm gonna agree. But then you have to furnish better solutions other than just observations and criticism. Here we go.
In the way that it does. And our academic culture and our activist culture, there's another way that it could be. I see no reason why academia.
Now I'm gonna stop and say this because I'm gonna let him finish. What he's getting ready to say here. This is the reason that motivated me to do this clip. What he's getting ready to say here.
Academia has to be so focused on documenting racism and racist inequities and submitting all of that to chi-square analysis, as opposed to studying something which I would think all thinking people would be equally interested in, which is how have people gotten ahead amidst the challenges of a stratified and economically unjust society? How have people gotten beyond it, and how might we bring that to scale? That is surely as worthy an academic project as chronicling once again how things aren't fair. It stuns me in a way that people with PhDs aren't sloveringly interested in that question and wanting to share it with the world. Too often, that sort of thing, at least in the United States, is shared in wonderful books, such as by Ian Rowe, who must be here, or there was a wonderful one written, unfortunately, it was actually in 2009 by Bill Cosby, and now, well, so we can't use his book, Come On People, anymore. But there are these books that actually outline how you can get beyond the injustices. And they don't get enough attention, partly because they're not seen as having the imprimatur of people who lead the academic culture. That's not fair, but that's just the unfairness of.
All right. Now, here's where I agree with him wholeheartedly. I'm not for sure if we're on the same page, right, in terms of application. But I certainly say when you talk about when people are when the African American is talked about, that they are talked about always in the negative, and though the African American community is not monolithic, it is treated as monolithic as well as opposed to any other community. So, for example, when people talk about the 78% of unwed birth and they say the black community, then they would say, well, what's wrong with the black community? Um, well, the problem or the black on black crime in the black community. So, what's wrong with the black community? As if those factors alone define the entirety of the black community. So why aren't they talking about, when we talk about, any other community, why aren't we talking about um, the successes in the black community? For example, he mentioned Bill Cosby right here. He mentions Bill Cosby, and obviously he had to duck away from that, but which I think is a shame. But anyway, he talked about Bill Cosby, and then but the Bill Cosby show was one of the shows that one of the first time in history, cinematic history, that hey, here was a successful, healthy black family, and even black people had a hard time with that. Even black people said, no, 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 we're not showing enough thugs, we're not showing enough ghetto hoochie mamas, and there was a lot of pushback on the portrayal that Bill Cosby showed. The reality is that there's always been Bill Cosby-like families in black communities. There's always been. So I agree with him to say, why don't we show that? Why don't we talk about that? But the other thing is that we also have to talk about is how do we get past it? And I think he's not talking about, how do we get past victimhood, especially if you are victims? And if you're not even willing to acknowledge the wrong that was did, you can never get past it. And a lot of Americans are refusing to get past it. Alright guys, look, that's my perspective. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. Till next time, I'll see you then.